Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt inside the Relief Factor studio. Jonathan Williams is a friend of the show for a long time. He's principal economist at the American Legislative Exchange Council, and he comes on whenever I need to talk to a real economist. Good morning, Jonathan. I was worried that you wouldn't be here because of what Tim Walz said last night. Might have caused you to faint. I'm glad you're okay, but I want to play for you two quick cuts of what the governor of Minnesota said last night. Can we play them, Adam, please? Cut number 18 and 19.
They'll start jacking up the costs on the middle class. They'll repeal the Affordable Care Act. They'll gut Social Security and Medicare. And they will ban abortion across this country, with or without Congress. If you're a middle-class family or a family trying to get into the middle class, Kamala Harris is going to cut your taxes.
Okay, Jonathan, your handle on Twitter is Tax Economist. What do you think?
Well, Hugh, it is laughable. I mean, to talk for someone like Governor Walz to talk about jacking up costs on the middle class, maybe he ought to look at his own backyard where he's been raising taxes in Minnesota, and it's been one of the worst states for economic outlook in our Rich States, Poor States report. Minnesota's had a horrible track record. They spent like drunken sailors on a 48-hour furlough through their entire state budget surplus that, of course, was caused in many cases, Hugh, by the funny money coming from Washington, D.C. here in the Biden bucks. That money was temporary. They spent through it, and then they went back to hardworking taxpayers in Minnesota and asked for more. So no surprise now that we're starting to see Americans vote with their feet away from Minnesota. That had not been the case in previous decades. But it's, once again, what happens when progressives run a state into a ground.
There are four parts of the Harris-Walz agenda we know. Number one is price controls. Number two is a promise to build 3 million housing units, which I'm going to come back. Number three is to raise the corporate tax rate. And then number four, which is hard to find, it's in print, but she hasn't said it yet, tax unrealized capital gains. Let's walk through each of those, Jonathan. What about the very first thing, price controls?
Well, price controls, I was just reviewing recently a book that I think Heritage published a number of decades ago, 40 Centuries of Wage and Price Controls, how it does not control inflation. We know that from history. But also, as several wise philosophers have said, surely we learn from history that we learn nothing from history. And so I think it's important to go back at the track record every time wage and price controls are tried, whether it's the United States, whether it's been Europe, whether it's been countries from antiquity, we find that basic economics comes out at the forefront, right? I mean, we know supply and demand, price signals are key for a functioning market. And what that means, I mean, just look at the reversal of the fortunes of Argentina in recent months now under the new president, where all of a sudden getting rid of some of the housing, wage, and price controls and rent control, for instance, in Argentina has dramatically increased supply. I've seen in recent weeks here of the housing stock there in Buenos Aires. So, I mean, one real world example from a huge turnaround just recently, but of course, under the proposals that we've been hearing coming out of Chicago, which is somewhat ironic, given all the bad proposals that we've actually seen come out of Illinois and Chicago recently. This is going to be moving in the exact opposite direction, including more costs and more shortages when it comes to housing across the United States.
Now, Jonathan, the second part, I'm going to build 3 million housing units. I did land use law until I retired from the active practice of law in 2016. I did it from 1989 to 2016. 25 years of advising landowners how to get units built. The federal government, the only thing the federal government can do is delay a project. They can't advance a project. Local governments approve housing projects. State governments delay them. The federal government really delays them via the EPA, the Army Corps of Engineers, and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. What do you make about a president who promises to build 3 million housing? It's insane.
Well, it's somewhat the same level of economic insanity as taxing unrealized capital gains, right? Unconstitutional and insane from a policy perspective. But when you look at what we actually need on housing, and this is something that ALEC and our members have been at the forefront, to your point, Hugh, at the state and local level, where we're seeing positive change and actually bringing about better market conditions to get rid of permitting issues and barriers that, look at, I think recently the National Association of Home Builders estimated estimated that nearly $100,000 per new housing construction comes in regulatory costs. So looking at the ways to reduce red tape, something we've spent a lot of time at. Or you look at our friend Governor Gianforte out in Montana, that really has led I think the bipartisan Montana miracle when it comes to zoning reforms and actually increasing opportunities to have better supply and reduce prices. I mean, that's the real solution here. We have the solution from the 50 laboratories of democracy, positive free market change versus, I mean, this is why we call Washington the land of make-believe, right? I mean, this fantasy land thinking that a central government in Washington, D.C. even knows what to build and where, but the idea just practically that it would build that many million new units, it's a scary potential new reality for the United States. If the federal government would take that kind of action and that kind of control, command and control over the economy, Hugh.
Whenever I look at efforts to house the homeless, Jonathan, and I find out what the per unit cost is, it's usually at more than $500,000 because government just doesn't know how to do this. They don't know how to do basic things like select land sites based on balance of cut and fill of grading. They don't know how to do anything when it comes to housing, and then they hire consultants. It gets very, very expensive. It gets to be a nightmare. Let me ask you, if we wanted to increase housing stock in the United States, what would your magic wand will into being?
Well, I think it's basically removing the barriers that are out there that are really dramatic barriers to housing supply, such as the regulatory costs that I mentioned a minute ago, and also looking at the opportunity to increase supply through some of the reforms like Governor Gianforte's in Montana by looking at some of the zoning issues, looking at permitting reform, those common sense free market ideas. I mean, this isn't rocket surgery, Hugh, as Art Laffer always likes to say. This is kind of common sense market-based solutions to a problem that government caused in these cases. And now, of course, what we see oftentimes from big government is it comes in with the so-called solutions to the problem it caused in the first place that would actually add to the problem even more and distort the market further.
If I were king of the forest, not queen, not duke, not earl, as they say in The Wizard of Oz, I would go back to 1923 and have the Supreme Court reverse the ruling in Ambler Realty versus City of Euclid and get rid of zoning. Zoning does not work. The market work, nuisance law worked, but zoning does not work. It has crushed the housing supply, but that's another day. Let's move on to the tax proposal. What would raising the corporate tax rate to 28% do to America, Jonathan Williams?
Well, I think it's pretty straightforward in that what we saw happen during the Trump tax cuts, the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which, Hugh, by the way, as you know, all the individual provisions of that go away at the end of next year. And ALEC is leading the way to help bring awareness. And we have about 500 state legislators saying, let's make those tax cut permanent for the future of our economy. But on the corporate side, what we would see in the opposite of what we saw during 2017, you remember when we saw all of those businesses in the United States announcing new raises and bonuses to their employees and looking at what happened to the trillions of dollars of profits, corporate profits that were sitting overseas and being used and made to work in other countries' economies. We saw those come back to the United States. We would see the opposite of that again. And we would see businesses not give their wages increases and the bonuses. We'd probably see more of those corporate inversions of American companies that we were used to seeing become foreign companies for no other reason than taxes. And you look at the research, and at least based on a lot of the estimates, 70% of corporate taxes that, those evil profits that we always hear about this week coming out of Chicago are borne by workers in the form of wages, right? And so when businesses would be forced to pay more, workers get less when it comes to wages and bonuses. And the other thing, of course, Hugh, that it does is that it would put the United States business tax rate well above many of our competitor nations in Europe, and of course, even above communist China. So not something I think we want to do right now is make ourselves less competitive than communist China.
Now, to the worst idea that has been surfaced by the Democrats, the very worst, a 25% tax rate on unrealized capital gains. Now, you're going to have to break that down for the Steelers fans, Jonathan. Explain what it is and explain what it would do.
Well, right. I mean, normally capital gains taxes, which already on the face of it are some of the worst ways to raise revenue for the federal or state governments dollar for dollar, are only levied after you sell a security or stock and actually realize the profit. If you have your money sitting there in your 401k or an investment account, unless you actually quote unquote realize the capital gain by making a transaction and selling that security, there's no taxable implication to that. What this would do is take us in a incredibly dangerous, uncharted world of coming in and essentially having a wealth tax on unrealized earnings that are sitting in an account that you have not sold, that are only paper earnings, and they haven't been realized whatsoever. And Hugh, I mean, you're the lawyer. I'm just the simple Midwestern economist here. But this has some major constitutional implications when it comes to a wealth tax and a direct tax on individuals that's not authorized by the 16th Amendment to the Constitution.
It almost got to the court this year. They backed away because they don't think the idea is going to go anywhere. I hope the court never has. It's the worst idea in the Democratic platform, and it does not do anything except it would drive capital out of the United States at an alarming rate. Jonathan, I want to thank you for joining me. It's always good to see you. Follow Jonathan at Tax Economist on X, because he's always on top of every issue having to do with taxes. And when the DNC gets together and starts talking this way, you really need to listen to Jonathan. That's at Tax Economist on X.